this is really important because certainty should be established by observation and testing. That's really what is the foundation and the bedrock of the scientific method. Unfortunately, and this is a big unfortunate development in the realm of science, certainty sometimes gets established by consensus, scientific consensus. And some people would say if it's consensus, it's not science. And science is not operated by consensus, but you will hear it all the time. You'll hear it on the news. You'll hear it on scientific programs. You'll read it in scientific journals. The consensus of scientists is.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Creation Podcast, where we discuss the science that confirms Scripture. I'm your host, Renee, and you're listening to the first episode of a 3-part series on building a new theory. We're often told that science is objective, but if that's true, then how can two intelligent, rational people look at the same pieces of evidence and yet come up with totally different explanations? And not just different, but mutually exclusive. What causes this divide? And is there anything we can do about it? In today's episode, we are going to start tackling these big questions and more as we look at the power and purpose of theory. Joining me today is ICR's very own president, Dr. Renée Guliuzza. Dr. G, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Well, Renee, this is exciting. I mean, I've been looking forward to this for such a long time. And not just me, loads of other people have been asking creationists, intelligent design advocates, where's your alternate theory? I mean, if what you're saying is so true, why don't you have something to replace Darwinian evolution rather than just criticize it? So finally, after many, many decades, we're getting around to putting together a theory of biological design. People have been looking forward to it. And so for you to host this show, it's exciting for me too. And everybody is really interested in what we're going to have to say.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited about it because you've actually been releasing articles in our Acts and Facts magazine called Why Biology Needs a Theory of Biological Design. And so you have parts 1 through 4 on ICR.org, and we're really stoked to be diving into this today. And so to start off with, I think for a lot of people, the idea of a theory can feel a bit abstract and a little bit hard to define. So how would you define theory, especially as it relates to the fields of science?
You're right. Theory is almost a frightening term when people start talking about the theory or the theory of this or something. And yet all of us live by theories. And so really before I even get into any technical explanations, there's kind of a functional role that theories do for people. And it's not just scientists who put together theories, but we live by a lot of scientific theories. And a theory is really just a story. It's a narrative. It's telling a story of how someone thinks something came into being, or it's telling a story of how someone thinks something operates. And it's going to lay it out that way. And in many ways, really good theories, and you'll relate to this, like being an English major, are really good stories. They have a plot, they keep your interest, and they develop things as they go along. And in many ways, even scientists could do a lot better if we told our information as a story, and people could then relate to it. So in people's minds, theory operates by helping to organize their thoughts about a lot of diverse observations. You see this, you see this, you see this. How do they all fit together? And so someone in the past will see all these observations and they'll put together a story or an account. And what it's doing is it's putting in people's minds, like if they can envision this, a series of cubby holes. And all the cubby holes have a label on them, just like when you're a kid in school. Shoes go here, hat goes here, gloves go here. They're these things. And as people look at the world around them, they look at it through these cubby holes with the labels on it. So that when they see something, the cubby hole says, oh, put that observation here. Stick that observation here, and it's going to start to fill in a narrative. And the person who puts the story together puts the cubby holes in an order which is helping to tell the story. And so as people look at the world around them, they start to fill in these cubby holes. And at least for what that is supposed to do, it makes sense in their mind, because people don't like to look around and have, what does that mean? Or how does that fit? Or how does it fit with this or this? The human mind intuitively likes to make sense of things. So the person who develops a theory comes up with this narrative to help the things to make sense in their mind. And so you have all these cubby holes, you have the labels on them, people are putting things in. And it doesn't matter really whether every cubby hole gets filled in or not. It's the organization of the cubby holes. It's the narrative itself, which is doing the work of a theory, which is to lead people to think about the world in a particular way.
So what I'm hearing is that it's a way of making sense of the world around us. And the cubby holes, in a sense, are doing that through a story. And I think it's really interesting because as you were talking, I even thought about the Bible and how that's written as one big story, God's love story to us. And so even the Lord, of course, knew that that's how our brains automatically think. And that's how we can best make sense of science and other fields as well. And so just looking at science, because that's what we specialize in here at ICR, of course, how would you define the idea of a theory in terms of making sense of scientific evidence? I've heard of maybe a hypothesis as being a way that we conjecture things about the world. How would a theory fit in with a hypothesis or even just standard fact that we would observe?
Wow, that's perfect. You took us right back to where we were as kids when we learned what the scientific method was, is that scientists develop a hypothesis. And when I was in school, I was told it was like an educated guess. But it's more than an educated guess, because guess kind of has this idea of, well, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, or maybe it's solid or not. So scientists develop hypotheses, and that is we look at various observations, and based on fundamental things of what we know previously in science, we speculate that maybe this is happening this way, but it's not a ill-informed speculation. It's an informed speculation that I think this might be what's going on here. And you put it in the way of a question that can be tested. So I think this is what's happening. And if it is, I'll come up with this type of test or this test to see if it's true or not. And so scientists develop hypotheses. And a theory is like a more robust hypothesis, because a hypothesis, as I just mentioned, is also trying to explain how something came into existence, or maybe how something operates. I think it happened this way. I think it's operating this way. And then you start to test it. And as you develop a hypothesis, it becomes a working hypothesis, where this hypothesis is then helping you develop questions. Oh, because I think it's happening this way, maybe this is what's going on inside. And so you develop a question that will help you develop a test. And if it's a really robust hypothesis, you might say, is this what's happening inside? I predict it will be this. So the hypothesis can lead you to questions. They can lead you to develop predictions. And all of those things taken together, questions, predictions, testing, experiments, all of those things taken together develop a research program where you have researchers and graduate students and equipment, and you start to develop all this stuff so that you can start to test these things. And so that's how a research program develops out of a hypothesis.
So the theory itself is somewhere on the spectrum between hypothesis, but it's more of an educated guess than a hypothesis, but it falls short of being established scientific fact.
Right, that's exactly. And some people would say that there really aren't any really established facts on things scientifically, though we use them as facts. And sometimes we would say they're laws. This is a law of science, the law of gravity, because nobody observes anything that is contrary to that. And so really you would have a guess, you would have a hypothesis, you'd have a robust hypothesis, and then you would have a way of thinking about the world that has been demonstrated to be true or accurate, or at least consistent with observations over and over again. And then it becomes a theory, a scientific theory. So it's not a bad thing to have a theory at all in any sense of the way, but it's not as robust as a scientific law. So we have a theory of how we think, and a lot of evidence seems to indicate that it's true, something operates or the way it came into existence.
So although there's some degree of certainty perhaps with a theory, it can change and it can be debunked in a sense. Is that correct?
Sure.
Okay.
You're right. There is a sense of certainty, more certainty with a theory, but it can be and always should be, it should be in a position where it can be debunked. Once you set something up to where no amount of evidence or observations can falsify it, then you've drifted out of the realm of science altogether into something far, far different from that. But then let me just comment about what you said about a certain level of certainty. And this is really important because certainty should be established by observation and testing. That's really what is the foundation and the bedrock of the scientific method. Unfortunately, and this is a big unfortunate development in the realm of science, certainty sometimes gets established by consensus, scientific consensus. And some people would say if it's consensus, it's not science. And science is not operated by consensus, but you will hear it all the time. You'll hear it on the news. You'll hear it on scientific programs. You'll read it in scientific journals. The consensus of scientists is. The problem is many scientists don't have a clue of what the theory really means or understands, because scientists can be moved in a herd, in a crowd, and there are penalties for stepping outside the lines in the scientific community. And that's the problem with consensus. You get people who say, well, I hold to this, but they really don't know what's talking about, and they bring their weight of scientific authority to it. You have others who may be even doubters or skeptics, but because they'll get hammered down if they transgress what everybody else is saying, they won't speak up. So consensus and consensus science is never a good way to establish the validity of a scientific theory. Scientific theories should always be established by observation and testing. And you can say, well, most people think or most people would lean towards this, but that still has to have a level of tentativeness to it, that even the majority can be wrong. And if we could do a whole additional program on many instances throughout history where the consensus of scientists was absolutely and totally wrong and led people astray. So has a level of certainty that should be established by observation and testing and not by a consensus.
Wow. Well, that is really interesting. You say that too, because one of the biggest theories, of course, in science today is that of evolution.
Right.
And that is by far the leading biological theory that we have. And it seems like, at least for me growing up, that every scientist or every expert that I read about believed that evolution was a legitimate theory, but they almost treated it like it was fact, like it couldn't be debunked. And so it's really interesting talking about the cubby holes, because it felt like those were all cubby holes that, all the evidence had to somehow fit into when it came to evolution. And so we know that it shapes people's view of biology, but how would you say it does that? How does evolution shape how people view the field of biology as a whole, and even just specific examples of that?
Well, biology is the one field of science that almost always has theological implications to it, because creatures are alive. They're not like this table. They're not like rocks. There's something fundamentally different about creatures. And we're going to get into this in our other episodes, they show features of design. They show features of purpose. They show features that in any other realm we would attribute to a designer or an engineer. They have parts that fit together. They have parts that fit together for a purpose. We're looking at each other with eyes that clearly have a purpose. We're alive because we have a heart that's pumping. And so people see, oh, this is pumping. It's pumping a fluid that has a purpose. So living creatures always have these theological implications to them, which is consistent with what the Bible says. The Bible says we know that there's this God because of what we can see in the creatures there. So biology, unlike geology, tends to have this element to it. And when people look at creatures, the natural question is how does it get to? And I know we'll get to this a little bit later in this podcast, but that is always raising these issues in people's minds. What What Darwin did is he changed how science operates in many ways, because when you're talking about the origin of these creatures and how they came to be, that is something which you really can't check by observation and testing. You have to extrapolate into the past. You have to look at things in the present. You have to kind of like extrapolate backwards in time, which then evokes a lot of imagination and historicity. And even some other evolutionists have recognized that Darwinian evolution and evolutionary biology is different than physics. It's different than chemistry in some ways. It's got this element of speculation to it.
Yeah. And of course, the diversity and design of living creatures, I mean, that's the whole point of evolution, is showing how that can come about without the need for a creator. However, even evolutionists recognize, some sort of design happening, even if they're attributing it to nature versus God. And it's really interesting because I have a quote here from Ernst Mayr, who, as you know, was a Harvard evolutionary theorist. And he says, Darwin introduced historicity into science. Evolutionary biology, in contrast with physics and chemistry, is a historical science. Laws and experiments are inappropriate techniques for the explication of such events and processes. Instead, one constructs a historical narrative consisting of a tentative reconstruction of the particular scenario that led to the events one is trying to explain. The testing of competing historical narratives became the methods of evolutionary biology, outweighing experimentation. Natural selection explains the adaptiveness and diversity of the world. It no longer requires God as creator or designer. The creation, as described in the Bible, was contradicted by almost any aspect of the natural world. Every aspect of the wonderful design so admired by the natural theologians could be explained by natural selection. So, of course, he's talking about there how Darwin really did change people's view of biology, and suddenly the fact of God creating everything that people had believed for so long was now being replaced by, well, nature is its own God. Nature is creating everything, and the design we see, it's all an illusion. And so with that, I want to circle back to what you were talking about earlier with the cubbyhole analogy. We at ICR, of course, are doing a lot of research and creation science that supports God's creation of the world. And one of those evidences, for example, in biology, are the soft tissues that we find in dinosaurs that can't last billions of years or millions of years, as creatures are evolving. So whenever we get evidence like that so clearly contradicts the evolutionary narrative, and they don't fit into those cubby holes that are established in people's minds, what do scientists do with that? How do evolutionists combat that?
Well, what you're talking about is that when we dig up a dinosaur bone nowadays, we thought it would be completely mineralized, that it would be almost like rock. And that's what I was taught in school, and I know that you were taught. And I know even some paleontologists still think that, because Dr. Brian Thomas was talking to one who was excavating, she's a graduate student, a bone, and he asked her about the soft tissue, and she said, well, there's none in here because it's a fossil. And so she wasn't even up to date on the fact that these tissues, and what we're talking about when we're talking about tissues is when you look at the microscopic level and some of the mineralized substance has been dissolved away with acids, you still find blood vessels. You still find blood vessels which look like what they have blood cells still in them. You still find cells that make bone. You still find connective tissues there, like collagen and other things, that if these bones were really 65 million years old or older, into the hundreds of millions of years, that you would not expect to find blood vessels, blood cells, collagen, and so on and so forth, that still can be stretched. You can actually take it under the microscope, stretch it, and it snaps back. And so, how is this fitting into their story? So how does that fit into a cubbyhole? How do you work on that? And one way to do it is you just change the labels on your cubbyholes. And unfortunately, with many of these scientific theories, the people who are really the gatekeepers of them should be honest enough to say, hey, this doesn't fit. Maybe we need to reassess our assumptions. Maybe we need to reassess the theory itself of what it's all built on and go back to the drawing board. But that doesn't happen. It's very, very difficult to dislodge a theory. And so often they will just change the label on the cubbyhole. And they'll do it overnight. They'll change it today to exact opposite of what it was yesterday, those things. Or they'll just say, it's okay for you to stick it in this cubby hole that doesn't quite fit, and we'll come up with an answer for it in the future. And so just use it as a placeholder for right now. Or they'll just not put it in any cubby hole and almost ignore it altogether. And that, as I said, you don't have to fill all the cubby holes. It's a story. It's a narrative. Even as the quote that you just read, Ernst Mayr said, Darwin introduced historicity. Laws and experimentation isn't exactly like you would use in chemistry. And he says the scientist builds an historical narrative. Well, that's just another name for a story of how all of this thing fit together. He's putting all of this together. He's almost wrapping it up for us. He says they develop a story. You can't always test the story. Sometimes the story could be wrong on those things. But then he comes to the conclusion that this story shows that there was no need for a designer, and all the things that were discussed in the Bible have been shown to be factually wrong on that. So he closes the loop on where the theory is supposed to go. It's to lead people to a certain way of looking at the world, which means that we can explain all of these things without a designer. But you raise a great question. When you have a theory, how do you handle contrary evidence?
It's interesting because some people are just so hardened, like you were saying, that they just change the labels on the cubby holes rather than go back and rethink, well, maybe this theory isn't quite right. Because as we explained earlier, like theories can be changed. That's, the point of it being a theory. It's not, of course, established fact, and but yet they treat it like it is. And so they're trying to force this evidence into cubby holes that will just never fit. And it's so exciting because here at ICR, we're just increasingly uncovering that evidence that it's just kind of punching at those cubby holes in a sense, I guess. But, for those people that maybe aren't so hardened, there's several people that might at least suspect that Darwinian evolution is wrong or that there's something not quite right there. And if that's the case, then why does it so heavily dominate our culture even today?
Wow. Boy, that's almost a whole separate episode in and of itself. It is the dominant. And it's not just creationists. It's not just intelligent design advocates, which see problems with current evolutionary theory. There are a lot of observations coming up in science which are not fitting in the cubby holes, right? And many evolutionists even know this as well. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, as we study creatures, there is so much that is being explained by engineering. And we'll get to this in our next episodes. And there's so much that's consistent with an engineering explanation. And there are systems which are nearly identical to human engineered systems operating in creatures that you're thinking, wait a second here. Why are these things so similar? So there are things that don't fit with current evolutionary theory, and there are things that we are observing which are strongly arguing that these creatures appear to be really, really engineered and designed. So what you're saying is, why don't we just start with an open mind, just start questioning evolutionary theory and start tossing it out or start tossing out portions of it which don't fit? That's a great question. Well, theories have their own protective mechanisms set up. And once people get a theory, I'll give you several reasons. It's hard to let go. For one, even before the protective mechanisms, a theory, even if it's not a great theory, is better than no theory for most people. And I'm like that. You're like this. We have a story, have a narrative which is helping to explain things in life to us. And that gives us at least a feeling of peace. Because people don't like saying, I don't know, or this is all a mystery. They like things to fit together in their minds really well. They don't like having dangling things out there. And so until a better theory or a better explanation, a better story comes along, people will hang on to this story because it's better than just letting go and being adrift and saying, I don't understand. So until something better comes along, people tend to hold on to the old one until it goes. Number two, theories get set up in ways that it's hard to dislodge them, and maybe that's good. Some people would say that's good. You shouldn't just be kicking theories to the curb just for trivial evidence. It should be hard to dislodge a theory. But what makes it hard to dislodge a theory is because there are gatekeepers to the theory. And the gatekeepers kind of set the rules for what will be considered as evidence to dislodge their theory. And the gatekeepers tend to define what questions can even be asked on things. So you can't even ask questions many times or seriously, I'm serious. So you couldn't get funding in many places to ask questions which would be contrary to evolutionary theory. You could not get any government funding or any funding to study the evidences for intelligent design in creatures. That would just never be funded. So they control what questions can be asked on those things. As I mentioned, they control what the labels are on the cubby holes, and they swap them out, and they let you put different things into them, and they let you use them as placeholders. And evolutionary theory is very elastic by nature. It can almost absorb any observation. Creatures are fast because of natural selection, but slow creatures are slow because of natural selection. Big creatures are big because of natural selection, but small creatures are small because of natural selection. Anything and everything fits into it. Strong, weak, anything you want. It can all fit into this theory. The third reason, this is important too, it dominates. It dominates society. It's the only explanation that's out there for right now. You learned it in school. I know that you tend to still explain things through that because nobody's replaced it with a theory of biological design. I learned it in school. Evolutionists learned it in school. So it's in first place, not because it's really great, because it's the only one in the race right now. And until someone gets out there and races with something else, it will continue to be the dominant theory. Let me give you a quick example. And this would be for anybody watching this podcast as well. We know that there are fish that live in creeks, and they are certain species. They're pigmented and they have eyes. Somehow, some way, some of those fish get swept into caves. And the next time you observe them, they're hypopigmented and they have no eyes. And there are many other changes as well. If I were to ask the average person on the street, intelligent design advocate, creationist, or evolutionist, I'm asking anyone, how did this happen? They would come up with a story, a narrative, which would say something to the effect, well, maybe during reproduction, sometime before or during the cave, a mutation happened to the genes that are making the eyes, and they broke those genes, and so eyes didn't develop. And maybe mutations happened to the genes that lead to pigmentation, and it broke those genes, so pigmentation broke down. And it's not a disadvantage in a cave not to have pigmentation. It's not a disadvantage not to have eyes. And in fact, if you don't have to build those things, you save energy, so it might even be an advantage. And so with those broken genes and those for pigmentation and eyes, it leads to an advantage, and they go on to reproduce. And pretty soon, the eyeless, hypopigmented fish take over the entire population. And evolutionists would say, that's how it happened, and see, this is how evolution can take place. Creationists would say, well, that's how it happened, but it doesn't explain how we got eyes. The bottom line is this. Everybody's using the mutation selection mechanism to explain the eyeless fish. Everybody's using it. Nobody's asking any different questions. That shows how dominant evolutionary theory is in our society. We think, and I know we'll get to this on our next podcast, we think we can come up with a far better explanation. We can ask different questions to explain those changes in the fish.
I think there's so much good stuff in what you just said because, even with Christians who have the best intentions, who would say 100% the Lord designed each creature distinctly and he made them all according to their kinds in the beginning. I've heard so much talk of microevolution, of natural selection, of mutations, as you mentioned. And, I even had someone once tell me that we know God created everything, but we don't know how he did it. he could have used evolution. He could still be using evolution. And it's not because they had bad intentions of saying that. It's not because they, want to debunk the Bible. It's just that's all we've been taught. And there's no alternative. And so, of course, we're going to be using some of those selectionist ideas in our thinking. And that just shows, as this podcast is all about, the power of theory, how it's influencing our thinking without us even knowing. And I think that's such an important point, all those things you brought up. And so as we transition now to how a theory is answering a lot of the big questions we have about science and, of course, life, let's look at specifically with science, what is a theory ultimately supposed to do in scientific fields?
Right. Scientists need theories. They use theories. And as I mentioned, a theory it's a story, and it's helping you to organize things, but it's a hypothesis. This is how I think something came into existence, or this is how I think something operated. And so a theory is not a bad thing in and of itself. It's an organizing principle. And everywhere we look, every field of science has their theories. So we exist in a universe. The first thing that people see is a universe. They see galaxies. They see all of these things. The question is, where did all this come from? How did it get here? And we can develop a theory, but evolutionists or naturalists, materialists have developed a theory as well. It's called the Big Bang Theory. And that is their explanation for why we see what we see out there today on that. And the theory constrains the questions they ask. It guides their observations and things like that. Then we bring it a little closer to home. We look around at the geology all around us. We see layers of rocks. Everybody's seen the layers of rocks. We see fossils in those layers. We see things. And the question is, well, how did these get here? Where did they come from? Nobody has really seen these layers get deposited. And so where did they come from? How did they get here? And the materialists have a theory for that. It's called uniformitarianism. In their view, the present is the key to the past. In other words, what you observe today is probably what explains what happened in the past. And since we don't see massive layers being deposited today, we see small little accumulations of sediment. They assume, and this is their theory, that slow accumulations of sediment on the continents, when some of them were inundated with water, or maybe the continents have sunk and they rose, this led to the placement of all of these layers. Now, as creationists, we have an alternative theory developed by the founder of this ministry, Dr. Henry M. Morris, called flood geology. And we interpret those layers as rapidly placed in a flood. So it's a competitive theory. It's a competitive explanation for the origin of those things. So as we just basically touched on there, what a theory is supposed to do is it's supposed to answer really big questions. You can get a hypothesis for the smaller questions, but the big questions, you develop a theory, and the theory is a unifying framework to interpret what you see. And so theories number one, answer big questions, and theories number two, probably as important as answering big questions, they serve as an interpretive framework. You will filter what you see in cosmology through Big Bang. You will filter what you see in geology through uniformitarianism or flood geology, and you will filter what you see in biology through Darwinian selectionism. And everybody right now is currently doing that. I see this and I filter it through that. I interpret it in that sense. And so evolutionists have to develop a theory which is going to answer some really big questions.
Yeah, and I actually have a couple quotes here from two of those evolutionists who have addressed this idea of evolution answering those questions as we talked about. And so one of them is from an Australian evolutionist named Peter Godfrey Smith, who I know you are familiar with. And he said, the apparent design of organisms and the relations of adaptiveness between organisms and their environments are the big questions, the amazing facts in biology. Explaining these phenomena is the core intellectual mission of evolutionary theory. Natural selection is the key to solving these problems. Selection is the big answer. And of course, even reading that, it's interesting because, he's deifying natural selection already in that statement by saying that it is the answer. And we know, of course, where we get our true answers. And then we also have a geneticist at Harvard, Richard Lewontin, and he said, life forms are more than simply multiple and diverse, however. Organisms fit remarkably well into the external world in which they live. They have morphologies, physiologies, and behaviors that appear to have been carefully and artfully designed to enable each organism to appropriate the world around it for its own life. It was the marvelous fit of organisms to the environment, much more than the great diversity of life forms, that was the chief evidence of a supreme designer. Darwin realized that if a naturalistic theory of evolution was to be successful, it would have to explain the apparent perfection of organisms and not simply their variation. So it's interesting because here we have a Harvard geneticist who acknowledges why Darwin came up with the theory that he did. And not only that, but they can see these creatures that appear to be designed for their environments, that they have adapted to be able to, carefully and artfully designed, to be able to appropriate the world around it. And I think that's so interesting because we're all looking at the same evidence as we talked about in the intro. And yet we have these evolutionists that are so hardened and so determined to be able to say, no, it's just an illusion of design.
Exactly. Actually it would be, for anybody who's watching this podcast, this would almost be a good time to pause the podcast and hit reverse, back up, and reread those quotes because they are so full of really, really good information. And both of them are saying evolutionary theory exists for a purpose. There was a purpose to developing evolutionary theory. And Peter Godfrey Smith, he says, there's a purpose. We have a big question. He's even using the same thing. Evolutionary or theories exist to answer big questions. And evolutionary theory was answered this big question of why do organisms have this design? He says the apparent design of organisms and the relations of their adaptedness to their environment. In other words, why do they fit their environment so well? Why do birds fit the air? Why do fish fit the water? They look like they were made to be there. And so
imagine that.
Yeah, imagine that. So he's seeing this and he said, that's a big question. That's a big question. And he knows that question has theological implications. Theology dominates the thinking of evolutionary biologists. They're not atheistic. It's not pushed out of their thinking. Theology dominates their thinking, and they know that this is a big question that has to be answered. And Lewontin, he says the same thing. He says it's not just that the diversity of creatures that's out there, it's that they have this exquisite fit. They have this exquisite ability to match their environment there. And it's this, as he said there, the apparent perfection, this apparent perfection that you see in these creatures. And Darwin knew that if a theory was going to be successful, it had to explain these things. So people who are listening to this podcast, boom, boom, this is important. Theory has a purpose. It always has a purpose, and it is to shape the way people look at the world. And Darwin built his theory. Both these gentlemen mention it very clearly. Darwin built his theory, and the subsequent people after Darwin have added to his theory with the purpose of explaining this apparent perfection of creatures, the exquisite fit of those creatures to their organism. And I could even add their behaviors and all of their systems and all the way down to the molecular level that we look at it now. We see apparent perfection. We see exquisite fit. And they're telling us, and I hope the listeners of our podcast get it, that theory exists to explain that, and theory will shape the way you look at the world, and theory will shape the way you understand biology. So I know we're going to lead off with this on our next podcast, but theory really matters. It's not just enough to answer questions and object to things that evolutionists say. You really have to come up with a better way to look at the world and to understand things about the world. And theory is what's constraining all of that. You change the theory, you're going to change a lot. You answer one question of something that evolutionists that say that might be nonsensical or scientifically invalid. All you've done is just point that out. What we really need to do, and this is important, is to fundamentally change the way people look at biology. And you're not going to do that until you come up with a replacement theory.
Yeah, and it so surprises me that, Darwinian evolution has been an idea for 150 or so years, give or take. And even still, we don't have a Christian alternative as far as, one that's not only biblically accurate, but scientifically grounded. And so that's what's really exciting with what we're talking about in this series. However, there is this movement of intelligent design. And so I'd love to touch on that just a little bit as far as how, the evolutionary theory maybe fits in with intelligent design, or what difference that might make as far as Darwin's thinking. Is there an alternative? Is it possibly an alternative to the evolutionary thinking that so pervades even Christians?
Well, in the very big, broad sense, intelligent design is an alternative to that. We as creationists are intelligent design advocates. There are other intelligent design advocates which would not be creationists. And the alternative explanation to random processes, which we'll discuss in the next podcast, for this apparent perfection that we see in creatures, is that they look apparently perfect because they really were engineered and they really were designed from the beginning. So that is the alternative explanation for that. And so you have a large body of people who are advocating for an alternative explanation or theory. But here's the problem. Amongst even intelligent design advocates of all stripes of them, we don't have an alternative theory. We have things that we observe which are hard to fit into evolutionary theory. We've observed certain types of complexity where unless all of the parts are at the right place at the right time and the right amount in biological systems, it won't function. Therefore, how do you explain this through a slow, iterative process? Mr. Evolutionist, we would explain it doesn't seem to fit into your theory. Mm-hmm. And we see certain levels of complexity which are so very hard to explain from a probability standpoint that it's like, what are the odds of getting all of these things to work? The probability of that is incredibly small. And when we look at the universe, we might see all kinds of features of the universe or laws. And they all seem to fit together. They seem to be fine-tuned for life. So you have this fine-tuning, you have specified complexity, you have what people call irreducible complexity, or we call it ICR, all or nothing unity for those things. And we say, well, see, this is an alternative theory, but it's not an alternative theory. These are observations which we may infer are best explained by intelligent design, but what they aren't doing is they're not helping us to develop questions. They're not helping us to make predictions. So I observe irreducible complexity. I observe that you have to have all the parts in the same place at the right time. Where is that leading me to develop questions and make predictions? Well, I can predict, I predict I'll see it in other organisms. Okay. So evolutionists come back and they say, well, we think actually natural selection can explain irreducible complexity, and we think natural selection can explain specified complexity. We think our mechanism can explain these things. And in fact, you hold to our selectionist mechanism yourself, so you're not really different from us in that regard. But, Mr. Intelligent Design Advocate, they would say, where's your alternative theory? In other words, they would put it to you like this, and anybody listening to this podcast, it's put to you just like this as well. If I was an evolutionist and you are an intelligent design advocate, creationist, I would say to you, okay, you believe that organisms were designed. You believe organisms were engineered, and you hold to that very, very firmly. So based on this idea that you have, what research questions are you developing, and what research program have you put together that is fundamentally different than what we're doing? What questions are you asking that are different than the questions we're asking? And how are you approaching research, which is different than we're approaching research in any way? And if you don't have different questions, you don't have a different research agenda, you really don't have a theory. You haven't put something together which unifies all of these thoughts. And so they come back, and that's the whole purpose of this first podcast, is to explain why we need a theory of design, why there isn't one out there right now, why we don't have something which is helping us develop newer and better questions, have fresher ideas than what the evolutionists are explaining. Why do we explain the loss of eyes in cavefish in almost an identical fashion as evolutionists? Why aren't we coming up with different questions for all of these things? And the reason is because evolutionary theory dominates everybody's thinking, even if you don't take it to the extent that evolutionists do. They take it further, we take it less. Basically, we're advancing a lighter version of evolutionary theory. We're not advancing a counter theory to evolutionary theory. So that's the purpose of this podcast, is to explain what a theory does, what's it supposed to do, why evolutionary theory is dominating everybody's thinking, why it's hard to dislodge it, why we don't currently have a replacement theory. And then, Lord willing, in the next podcast, we'll explain, well, if theory is supposed to interpret observations, and if theory is supposed to explain answer the big questions, how does evolutionary theory do that? Why is that important? How will we be able to counter that in our third podcast on all of these kinds of things? So this is to show that we need a theory. We don't have a theory, and what a theory is supposed to do and how it really, really shapes people's thinking.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great teaser for our next couple podcasts, because we are really doing some exciting new pioneering things here at ICR, and I'm really stoked to talk about it. And before we close, I would just love to give you the opportunity, if there's anything we didn't already cover on this podcast, anything that you'd love to go more in depth about, is there anything else you would like to share with our listeners?
A challenge. We had several challenges. This whole podcast is supposed to explain what a theory does, how it's this narrative that guides people's thinking and helps them make sense of the world around them, and how we're kind of trapped into it. And I had two challenges, and I'm speaking primarily to creationists or intelligent design advocates who are watching this podcast out there. One of them was, how would you explain the cavefish differently? How do you come up with an alternative explanation? Or are you satisfied with mutation selection, but saying, well, it's just limited. It can't do everything that Darwin claimed. It can't explain the origin of eyes, and it explains how things can be broken. But do you honestly have a better explanation for that? And inside, are you content that you think that's how the Lord made organisms to adapt? That when everything else on your body is so exquisitely designed and function, are you content with random broken mutations fractioned out by a struggle to survive? Is that how you think the Lord put things together? That's challenge number one. And challenge number two was, how would you be approaching research differently? What different questions are you raising than evolutionists are raising? What research program would you be developing that is different? And if you listen to this, you honestly can't say, well, I can't think of how it would be different, then you need to listen to the next podcasts, because we have a better way of approaching it. But before we get to the third one, we have to go through number two, which will help explain not just that evolutionary theory was meant to be an alternative to intelligent design, but what the elements of evolutionary theory are doing, how specific parts of the theory are counter, how specific parts are anti-design. And then when we get to part 3 of this series, we'll be able to counter those and come up with a viable theory of intelligent design. So we've got a lot of journey ahead of us.
Yeah, and it is I would just love our listeners to just know what you said is that this is breakthrough stuff. I mean, no one else is doing this. This is really, really exciting times at ICR. And so we are really looking forward to talking about it and being able to turn this Darwinian thinking that we've already touched on its head and start building a brand new theory of biological design. Well, Dr. G, thank you so much for joining me on the Creation Podcast today. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, to all of our listeners and viewers, thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of the Creation Podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. If you would like to learn more about ICR's work on building a new theory of biological design, you can check out Dr. G's Acts and Facts articles on icr.org. If you liked this podcast, please be sure to like, subscribe, and also share with your friends. It's really our heart to get the creation message out to as many people as possible. If you would like to receive the Creation Podcast a week early or our monthly podcast, Creation.live, 2 weeks early, you can click the link in the description to become a member on YouTube and Patreon. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
We want to say a huge thank you to our members and patrons. If you'd like to see your name here and unlock perks like early access to our podcasts, members-only polls and live streams, behind-the-scenes footage, or exclusive video content, links are in the description below.